Now, the Hittites are truly a lost civilization. This was the kind of civilization that television programs about the lost worlds love to feature. Something completely forgotten that was discovered through sheer accident and diligence. Until the late 19th century, almost nothing was known about them. The name was preserved in the Hebrew Bible, the name Hittite, most famously in the story of Ephron the Hittite, a prince who deals with the patriarch Abraham. But in that biblical story in the book of Genesis, there's no intimation that the Hittites are a great empire or have been a great empire. What is that story? We read in Genesis that the Hittites owned land in the area of the city of Hebron. And as the Bible recounts it in Genesis 23, Abraham seeks a burial place for his wife, Sarah, his beloved wife. And Abraham stood up from before his dead and spoke to the sons of Het, saying, I am a stranger and a sojourner with you. Give me possession of a burying place, that I might bury my dead. Who are these children of Het? They're the Hittites. They agree to give Abraham a place to bury his wife. Abraham offers to purchase it from them. They want to give it to him, but he insists on purchasing it for 400 shekels of silver in order to make sure that it is an acquisition of himself and his family. There's an assurance of the permanence of the acquisition in the biblical narrative. To quote again from Genesis, and the field and the cave that is therein were made sure unto Abraham for a possession of a burying place by the sons of Het, the Hittites. So the picture we get from this biblical episode is of Abraham, an outsider, negotiating with Ephron, the Hittite prince, an insider. This bewildered many students of the Bible because we don't know of references to the Hittites as insiders in this culture. But now that the Hittite civilization has been uncovered and that its writings have been deciphered and published, we understand that the Hittites themselves were outsiders in Canaan, but outsiders who could gain influence because they were members of a powerful empire. And again, to take us back to our superpower analogy with which I opened the lecture, much as Americans today might, in a foreign country, have the purchasing power to buy a house or a piece of beachfront or a villa. And we have the diplomatic protection of the United States to ensure that we could live there safely, or at least this has been true in many places until recently. So we, in a sense, are a kind of modern Hittite. We might be an outsider in another place, but because of our position in the world, we can gain a kind of insider status. Now, this understanding of the biblical story was only possible through the discovery of Hittite civilization. I mentioned that it had been lost, unknown. It was found through the efforts of scholars in fields in the triad that I've enumerated a number of times of philology, linguistics, archaeology, and religious and biblical studies. That is, there's an interplay of these scholars which allowed the picture of the Hittites to emerge. I mentioned the Amarna letters, the 14th century BC writings found in Egypt on tablets written in cuneiform, the tablets found by that peasant woman. In these tablets, archaeologists were able to read letters from Egyptian subordinates, vassals in Western Asia who were writing to the Egyptian courts. And one of the things that they wrote a number of times is, quote, the Hittites are invading our territory. That is, territory held by Egypt along the Mediterranean was being attacked by the Hittites. Now, when these letters were discovered and translated, the Amarna letters, people didn't know who the Hittites were, other than the biblical reference. So how could the Hittites be attacking the all-powerful Egyptians? In the subsequent decades, the decades after the discovery of these letters, archaeologists began to discover tablets in cuneiform script in Anatolia, in Turkey. These tablets were deciphered by the early 20th century, and the site of the Hittite capital, Hattusas, in Turkey, was discovered. And in it, there was a rich archive of both administrative and mythic material. The excavation of this material began in the 1910s and the 1920s, and scholars were able to see the remarkable achievements of the Hittite civilization and its connections to other Near Eastern cultures. Let me illustrate one of these connections. And here, once again, let us go back to the idea of the great powers, the superpowers. The great powers were Egypt and whoever was ruling in Mesopotamia. Among the finds at Hattusas were the inscriptions which recorded treaties and negotiations between these cultures. So there is a text which we can read of the treaty between Ramses II, identified as the pharaoh of the Exodus, and the Hittite king Hattusilas. The whole treaty is spelled out. How to divide the land, how to end the conflict. It's actually a model which many people have invoked for ending conflict in that part of the world. This is one of many documents which parallel the Amarna letters. You'll recall that the Amarna letters found in Egypt gave evidence of connections with the Middle East, that is, with Western Asia and the Mediterranean shore. Here, these documents found to the north, that is, in the Hittite country, in Turkey, showed evidence of connections with Egypt. So as the picture emerged in the 20th century of the material in these documents, we get a web of connections. And that is the picture that I'd like you to have and to develop as we go on. That is, the ancient Near East was a series of connecting cultures. At the Hittite capital and at other sites, there were many versions of myths, including a myth we have mentioned, and I will mention many times again, the Epic of Gilgamesh, a story which had international appeal and circulation. Therefore, it's hard to speak of a definitive, original version of a myth. That is, every one of the stories that we're going to encounter in this series is going to have variations. There is no fixed text. Let us contrast this with our idea of a text today. The Harry Potter books. The Harry Potter books, when a child goes to the store and buys the Harry Potter book, every copy of that book in every store is the same. Of course, that's natural. But this is not true in the ancient Near East. In fact, it'd be odd to find any two copies that are alike. Variation is the story, not singularity. These texts evolved, and they evolved through dissemination. They would start in one culture and go to another. Once in the second culture, they might be influenced and move back to the first. So one of the fascinating ways in which we can trace cultural connections in the ancient Near East is to look at variations in ancient Near Eastern mythology.